All right, welcome everybody to another episode of Stearns Stories. This week on the podcast, we have a special guest, Doug Thompson, who is the curator at the Minnesota Military Museum. We also have Eric Cheever, our curator of collections, with us as well. A year ago at this time, and in an alternate universe, this week, we would be getting ready for our big World War II event. That's not happening this year, but that's how we got connected with Doug. The Military Museum partnered with us last year to put that event on, and we're hoping to put it on again next year. So do you want to talk a little bit about yourself, Doug, and what got you into military history and all that?
Oh, sure. I'm Doug Thompson, the curator of the Minnesota Military Museum. Lifelong interest in military history started when, probably like Eric, when we were about 6 years old, playing with our father's old World War II memorabilia in the backyard with our friends, reading books, watching movies, just developed a lifelong interest in military history. And it's been a fun thing to study, an interesting thing to study, pretty enjoyable. So,
How long have you been with the Military Museum?
Been working at the Military Museum for about 10 years now, mainly as a collection specialist under our previous curator, and took over the full-time duties about 3 years ago. So it was a good build-up to taking over the reins for myself. I had good people I mentored under, and have enjoyed it so far. So
excellent. Do you and Eric want to talk a little bit about how you know each other?
Well, sure. I mean, boy, Doug, we've known each other for a long time. I think
30 years, maybe. I think.
Yeah,
we looked
a little younger back then, but
yeah.
we started. We met as reenactors, actually, probably out at Fort Snelling. Would be
probably, yeah. Rosemont or Fort Snelling, or one of those historical events that seem to pop up all over the place down in the Twin Cities all those years ago.
Yeah. So it's been a while, and it's great because we kind of have our two museums seem to have a kind of a natural partnership at this point, which I think is great. We're close to each other, physically. And look forward to doing more work in the future. So it's unfortunate that this year's World War II event was canceled, but hopefully it'll just be bigger and better next year.
It'll hopefully build up more anticipation for next year, because I know speaking with everybody involved last year, I think everybody was really excited to come back this year and try to recreate that feeling that we had last year, and the success that we had with all the people that showed up, and the involvement with the reenactors is so important in building relationships with the reenactors and everybody else involved. That synergy makes it a much better event.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree. So
the reenactors must be sad. They probably don't have any events to go to this year.
Not a whole lot this year. Pretty much everything has been canceled. So
makes sense.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yeah, no, that it is the times. It is the situation we're in, and everybody's doing the best they can with it. So next year we'll hope for bigger and better things, right, Eric?
Exactly. Well, that's why we're doing Zoom right now, right?
Exactly. Yep.
Well, I thought it'd be interesting. You guys have so many interesting collections at your museum that I enjoyed looking at when I got to tour it last year when we were preparing for our event. And I thought maybe we could pick one of those topics and maybe you could just share your expertise on it a little bit. And I thought the 99th Infantry or 99th Battalion, the Norwegian American soldiers, might be a topic that people might have interest in, because here we have an exhibit on the Japanese Americans and how they found a niche that they were involved in helping the war effort. And I thought it was interesting that there was a similar group of Norwegians that were chosen because of their Norwegian heritage. And I thought maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
You know, as a general overview, there are actually 5 separate infantry battalions formed in World War II. Obviously, there's the 99th, which we can talk about. There's the 100th Battalion, which was composed of Japanese Americans. Pardon me. There's a 101st Infantry Battalion, which were made up of Austrian Americans. That unit was dissolved in 1943. They didn't really go out and do anything. There's a 122nd Infantry Battalion, which surprisingly was made up of Greek Americans for operations and proposed operations in the Mediterranean in World War II. They didn't do a whole lot either. The 2 battalions are there's the 1st Filipino Battalion as well. They didn't really do too much. The 2 units that obviously did a lot were the 100th Battalion, the Nisei, and that's a completely awesome story all on its own. But the 99th Battalion, again, Caitlin, like you said, Norwegian Americans, formed at Camp Ripley in July of 1942. The word went out that they were looking for, to the different units around in the military, that they were looking for people that could read, write, and speak fluent Norwegian. And the idea was that they're going to use them in military operations in Norway. That didn't come to pass. So they ended up actually being an infantry battalion that fought mostly in Normandy and Northwest Europe. So.
And they were Alpine trained, were they not? Ski
they
troops?
Were what? Pardon?
Alpine trained ski troops.
They went out to Camp Hale and trained with the 10th Mountain Division. So they were learning to ski in the snow. They were learning again, like you mentioned, Alpine training for use in Norway. The idea was that they were going to be used in Norway to help liberate that country. So yeah, they were a very highly trained unit. Very cohesive unit, very patriotic. There are a lot of Norwegian nationals in the 99th Battalion, as well as farm kids from Minnesota, North Dakota, Iowa, all over the upper Midwest came to form the unit. So it's the only military unit formed in Camp Ripley during World War II.
Can you explain for non-World War II experts like myself what Norway's involvement in World War II was, or what their story was? Because it's not something you hear much about, and it's something I'm certainly not aware of. So what was their trajectory during the war?
Well, their trajectory was that they were invaded by Germany in April of 1940, when the rest of France fell. In April 9th, 1940, the Germans invaded Denmark, and they invaded Norway to keep Norwegian iron ore and Norwegian industry away from the Allied war effort. The Germans needed fjords to keep their battleships in. They needed the raw materials that the Norwegians were able to provide, and it was just another stepping stone in the Nazi in the attempted Nazi conquest of Europe. The Norwegians had a very strong resistance movement. A lot of Norwegian merchant marines and naval personnel came over to the Allied side and fought with the Royal Navy, the American Navy, and obviously some made it here to join up with the 99th Battalion. So basically, Norway had raw materials and resources that the Germans needed for their military operations. Is that about right, Eric?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, as well as the fjords, which was hugely important to the
Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. Yes, yeah.
They had nowhere to stage their ships. Yeah. So
when was Norway liberated?
Norway was actually liberated. The first Allied troops went there in May of 1945. There were somewhere in their neighborhood of 400,000 German troops stationed in Norway during the war. And the Americans had to go in and disarm those Germans and send them back to Germany or to POW camps, whatever. So when the 99th Battalion went to Norway in May of 45, it was with the understanding that they were going to help get the German soldiers out of Norway at that time. So
That's a lot of German troops to get rid of.
it was, and there's another aspect of the German occupation of Norway, and the fact that the Norwegians had a pretty robust resistance network, is all of those German troops that were in Norway could have been used on other war fronts. They could have been sent to Normandy. They could have been sent to the Eastern Front against Russians. So the Norwegians tying up those German soldiers kept them from being put to battlefronts where they could have been put to better use. And so it was really strategically, it was really important to keep those Germans in Norway. And, the Norwegians did a pretty good job of it. So.
That's interesting. I did not know that.
Yeah.
So what sort of artifacts and memorabilia from that 99th Battalion do you guys have there at the museum that people can come see now? Because you guys are open now, right?
Sure, yeah. Welcome anytime. We're open. We're going to actually be open as a little plug for us, 7 days a week from 10 to 5. So Sunday through Sunday, we're open every day through the end of September. So
Nice.
with social distancing, obviously, in play, we have face masks available for customers that come in. The staff are taking precautions to care for our health and for the health of our visitors, as you are too, I see. So.
Yep.
So the 99th Battalion, we have a special display in the 99th Battalion in our museum. We have several uniforms, artifacts, archival materials. We have uniforms in storage, and we're waiting for a bigger and better things to be able to display them. We have a lot of histories. We have a lot of private, personal, veteran histories of 99th guys in our archives. So, and we're still actively collecting stories from 99th Battalion veterans. So,
well, in the 99th, they did not remain the 99th Battalion throughout the war, correct? They became...
No, they did not. In January of 1945, they actually were folded into the 474th Infantry Regiment. They did occupation duty in Germany towards the end of the war, and so the 474th had the 99th in it, and they also had units like the Ranger battalions that were disbanded after service in the Mediterranean. There were all sorts of other disparate units that came together to form the 474th. The 99th being the primary unit that formed that regiment. So, hence
their shoulder insignia with the arrowhead with the Norwegian ship in it.
Yes, and it had the first Special Service Force red arrowhead, like you mentioned, and the Norwegian longboat featured prominently in their design. So, kind of a neat design.
It is. And didn't a number of personnel from the 99th become OSS operatives at some point?
They did. The OSS was actively recruiting members of the 99th while they're actually still training, alpine training out in Colorado, and they were recruiting them because of their dual language abilities, the fact that they spoke Norwegian and English. However, most of those 99th guys that became OSS agents actually dropped into France. Mostly right before and after D-Day, they dropped in to help French resistance groups destroy communications capabilities of the Germans to report on troop movements. So they were dropping behind enemy lines at great risk, personal risk to themselves, and in helping the war effort with intelligence gathering and things like that. So.
Yeah, it's a pretty fascinating story.
Yeah, in fact, it was a member of the 99th, Eric Eide from Minnesota, that parachuted into Hanoi at the end of the war to help to facilitate the Japanese surrender in Indochina. So he was he was a Minnesotan from the 99th that jumped in with an OSS team to help, of all people, Ho Chi Minh affect the Japanese surrender in Indochina. So,
which is an amazing story just in itself.
It is.
That whole theater, the Indochina theater, yeah.
Sure. So we had 99th guys that are really involved all over the world. So when the king of Norway came back from exile, he specifically asked the 99th Battalion to be his honor guard when he came back to Oslo. So there's lots of photographs, lots of films of the king coming back to Oslo from exile, and the 99th Battalion is marching him back to his palace, mostly because they were his affinity with them, because they were Norwegians or Norwegian Americans or Norwegian nationals. That was a really proud moment for the battalion and a great honor to the kings. So.
And a well-documented one, it looks like.
Well documented, lots of photographs, lots of film.
Yeah.
They made Life magazine. They were pretty well received in Norway, I might add too. There were actually a lot of marriages that came out of that occupation of Norway at the end of the wars. So.
Yeah. So do you know, are there any 99th veterans still living in the area?
I believe there are, not many.
Yeah.
I would have to go through my my contact sources. I know some family members of the 99th that have started associations on the 99th, and they have all those names, but right off the top of my head, I can't think of any. So
yeah. It's a long time ago.
But yes, there are 99th guys still alive. Where they are, I'm not exactly sure.
How many men were in the 99th to start?
The original complement was 1,001 men. They formed up at Camp Ripley. They were formed just like a regular infantry battalion. Yes, I believe it was 1,001. So
it's a good size.
Yes.
So the Norwegians, unlike the Japanese, the Nisei were second generation. So there were no Japanese nationals in the Nisei, but with the 99th Battalion, there were both children of immigrants and Norwegian nationals themselves. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah, there were, stereotypically, there were the sons of Norwegian farmers, local farmers from North Dakota and Minnesota. The Norwegian nationals typically were made up of Norwegian merchant marine. There were sailors that were not in Norway when they capitulated, so they were on merchant marine ships all over the world, and they put out the word that they were looking for these Norwegians to join the unit. So Norwegian nationals that happened to be in the country at the time, or merchant marines or family members and you didn't have to be a Norwegian national. There were typically at that time there were still a lot of Norwegian farm families in the area, and they were all speaking Norwegian around the house. So there were a lot of Norwegian speakers in the state at the time. So as there were German speakers and Italian Americans and whatever. So.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting story. Is there anything in your collection? Is there one piece that is the most interesting piece of the 99th, or is it all just kind of little pieces here and there?
Well, 2 years ago, we actually got a collection from the former supply officer of the 99th Battalion, and we have this item on display right now, but it's a 48-star American flag that the American troops paraded in front of the king when he was going back to the palace in Norway.
Wow.
So that 48-star folded flag is in our display case, and that was the national colors that were being paraded by the 99th when they went up to reinstitute the king back on the throne. So that's pretty special. But
And speaking of artifacts, Doug, in your years of reenacting, have you ever had the chance to ski on World War II skis?
No. I can barely stand up on regular modern skis, so no, I have not. Have you, Eric?
I have a pair that I'm staring at right now. That's why I'm asking.
Okay. No, and we have several pairs in the museum too, but I'm going to keep them as artifacts and not as recreational.
Yes, something I've always wanted to try though, just to see to see what their performance was or wasn't.
I'm sure they'd be just fine, and maybe a pair of snowshoes too. You'd like to try out, or?
Oh, that's what I use every winter. I've got several pairs at home.
You don't use the old World War II bear paws or anything like that, though.
Yeah, I got several pairs of World War II military issue from my grandfather that I still use. Maintain them every year, and.
All right.
Yeah.
No, I'm going to stay off the skis though. So.
It's probably good for the skis.
Not a bad idea.
And for
me,
whoever is going to be on the skis.
For one's personal well-being.
Yeah.
Yes.
As well as the skis.
Exactly.
It's best for everyone if we just stay off of them. So is there any other stories about the 99th you want to share? I just think it's such an interesting topic that, not everybody knows about.
They had apart from their time up in Norway, which was glorious for them because they had a populace that absolutely loved them, and what a change in occupying forces. The German forces were hated and not very well liked, and here you have these young Americans, a lot of Americans. Coming back to the home country, really a lot of these Norwegian Americans had family in Norway, and so there were a lot of family reunions happening in Norway at the time. There was such an affinity for them. The one interesting thing about the 99th Battalion I find interesting is, are you familiar with the Monuments Men?
We talked about them in our last podcast, yeah.
Sure. Well, the Monuments Men were responsible for searching out stolen Nazi war art. The Germans looted Europe's finest museums of their gold, their paintings, their statuary, and things like that. And the 99th Battalion assisted the Monuments Men in returning a lot of that stuff back to Allied control. And so they, for example, there was a series of mines. I think they called them. Look at my notes here. The Merzer mines that had tons of gold and artwork, and the 99th Battalion was responsible for making sure that artwork and that gold and stuff was taken out of Nazi control and brought to Allied control. So they were guarding supply trucks that were loaded with gold, kind of like Kelly's Heroes, right? Right, Eric?
Right. Yeah. So yeah, that's always. I love that story. What a fascinating career. Sure. The battalion.
Yeah, they certainly had an interesting story. I've got another peripheral story about an uncle of mine who was with a unit during the Battle of the Bulge. The 99th was in the Battle of the Bulge, and he talked about those Norwegians that sounded like Germans. So when there were German soldiers that were going behind Allied lines in the Battle of the Bulge, pretending to be American soldiers, and the Norwegians had that accent that a lot of the other American soldiers mistook for German accents. So there was a lot of questioning of 99th Battalion guys. They just had to open up their mouths sometimes to get that Norwegian accent, being mistaken for the German accent. And my uncle mentioned fighting with the 99th and having to deal with these guys that sounded like German soldiers. So there's
Yeah.
Where were they in the Bulge? Do you know offhand?
they're up by Stavalo and Malmedy, yeah, up by the northern part of the northern part of
Yeah,
the Bulge. So,
close to St. Vite.
north of yeah, up by Saint Vith and north of Bastogne.
Yep.
But the Malmedy massacre, a lot of people know about that. The execution of American prisoners happened up in that area. So yeah, the northern edge of the Bulge. So.
Sure.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot more we could talk about the 99th. Do you have anything?
Well, better yet, you guys can come up to the museum and check it out. So.
Yeah, well, anyone who's listening, they're open now, so it's perfect time to go and check out that history.
It's well worth the trip.
Yeah, it's you guys have so much stuff to look at. It's really fun to go there.
As is your museum. I've enjoyed your military themed exhibits that you've put on, and again, happy to help you guys out with any other exhibits you might be doing in the future. So.
Oh, we will be calling you, I'm sure. Do you have anything going on at the Minnesota Military Museum that you want to promote, that you want to talk about?
Our summer program is hopefully going to get back on track again. And the last Saturday of every month through September, we have what's called an up close program. And so what we do is we bring in an area expert on a particular piece of military hardware we have. We have over 40 macro artifacts at the museum: tanks, armored cars, artillery pieces. And so the last Saturday of every month, we're bringing in an expert to come in and talk about one particular item that we have in our outdoor exhibits. So we'll have people talking about helicopters, tanks. It's very fascinating. We had a really good turnout for it last year, and so that program started up again too. I would recommend going to our website to find out times and specific artifacts that we'll be discussing, but come and check it out. It's pretty interesting. So.
Yeah, I'll put a link to your website in the description.
Sure.
Just as a tie-in to another video that we're releasing this week is our historic cocktails. And this week we are making the French 75. Do you guys, what's your expertise on this French or what is the name of it? The 75 millimeter field gun?
So you're doing a drink on the 75?
Yeah, I made the French 75. It's going to be up this week. How to make the French 75 and kind of its background. Do you know anything about the weapon you can share with us?
Yeah, we obtained a French 75 for our collections 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. One of only a handful of original French 75 millimeter howitzers that are in museums in this country right now. We found a person out in Michigan that had a completely restored original French 75 that we have in our World War I artillery shed right now. Yeah. It was the only artillery piece used, one of the only artillery pieces used by the U.S. in World War I. As a general rule, we didn't send any of our artillery over to help in World War I. We went over and used French artillery because there was a lot of it. Mm-hmm. We were happy to add one to our collection. There were about 12,000 of them made during the war, World War I, and we have one of the few that are in museums in this country today. West Point has one. Mm-hmm. The National World War I Museum has one. The 1st Division Museum in Cantigny, Illinois has one, and the National U.S. Army Artillery Museum at Fort Sill has one. There are other ones scattered here and about, but those are the major museums that have one of those guns that we have in our collections. So one of the rarest artillery pieces in our collections.
Do you have it on display?
We do have it on display. We have an artillery shed at Camp Ripley with four World War I artillery pieces. We have 2 German and the French 75 and an artillery limber. Welcome to come and check it out. So.
Yeah, I'd like to see it now that I know a little bit about the connection between that and the drink, which was apparently named because of its lethal potency, which I can attest to because I drank one the other day.
Okay, you have the recipe for it, or?
I do. If you check out the video, you can make one at home. It's super easy. It's not hard. So
I'm
it's
gonna write
delicious
that.
too.
So one thing that's been on my mind, I think down the road, Doug, we'll have to do another podcast and talk about probably one of my personal favorite artifacts in your collection, the Easy 8.
Yes.
I think that is definitely worth some time.
The Jumbo Sherman.
Yes.
Yes. In fact, that's going to be one of our up close programs. I'm not sure. I'd have to have my schedule in front of me. I feel so unprepared today, but that's going to be one of our programs is on the Jumbo Sherman. So one of the rarest Sherman variants ever produced out of the 30,000 Sherman tanks made in World War II. There are only some 200 of this particular variant that were made, and this is one of only a handful that exists today. So,
and it's one of the only combat veterans, isn't it?
Yeah, this one actually came back from Europe at the end of World War II. Most of our tanks, jeeps, trucks, a lot of our military hardware was left in Europe at the end of World War II. It was given to our allies so they could rebuild their armies. Some of the only tanks that were brought back were these Jumbo Shermans because it was thought that they would be used for the invasion of Japan, which never happened. Mm-hmm. So luckily they didn't have to do a land invasion of Japan. And so these tanks made it to different Army, National Guard training grounds, and we happen to have one in our collection. So,
Wow!
And in fact, it's actually featured on our logo. That's a Jumbo,
there we go.
That's a Jumbo Sherman on it. So
that's great.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Doug, so much for talking with us today. I'm sure we could talk a lot more, but we can always have you back to talk about something else. Eric, you have anything else you want to add?
No, just thank you very much, Doug, for spending the time with us this morning.
Yeah.
Sure. You touched before on how different museums can work together, and I think in these times, it's kind of fun to work with museums that you typically wouldn't have any other connection with. Us being a military museum, you being a county museum. So when you can work with other museums to further the cause of history and to develop relationships with other museums, it's a win-win for both organizations. And we're really happy, really proud to be able to work with you guys with different things coming up, and looking forward to more of it in the future.
Yes. As are we. Well said.
Thank you, Doug. That was very nice. So yeah, thanks for talking with us this morning. Everybody go visit the Minnesota Military Museum. They have tons of cool stuff. So, all right, that's it for Stearns Stories. We will see you guys next time.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye.